Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now recently the fellas at Snarling Badger Games, as well as having a remarkable name, came out with Majestic 13, which is a game where you are fighting against alien forces invading the Earth. Sounds simple, right? Now this is the team that have also done Space Station Zero and the, Rain in Hell, the other one as well. And they've all been very well received. They are designed from the ground up so that you can play solo. Now, most of my gaming at the moment is solo because, well, everybody lives a million miles away from me, so having an opportunity to paint something up very quickly and, easily is what I'm looking at today. These guys have taken me about as long as it takes to ordinarily paint one miniature for the channel, so speed is key. And while they aren't gorgeous, they're finished. And now they're finished forever, so I've had a fair bit of fun with these. Now these guys are the O.D.E.A.R kits from Wargames Atlantic, with the exception of the shield, that is a bit from Anvil Industry. Now as always, all of the paints for these will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. So my brave volunteer for the demonstration is going to be the sergeant of this squad, and you'll see in the background the other fellas lurk and have already had a little bit of work done. But everything I do on this fella will obviously be done on the others too. Now after priming him, I've used Vallejo Grey rattle can primer to do that, and it doesn't matter too much what you'd use. I'd also recommend a very similar one might be Grey Sear, although anything light grey will do the job. What I have here is Beige Red from Vallejo, and I'm going to use this as his skin tone. Now always, I point out there's 1,000 different ways to paint skin, just pick one that you like, and base coat all of his skin. Bearing in mind, these O.D.E.A.R figures, they have got fingerless gloves, so don't miss out on those either. Now take your time with this one and go easy. You try to avoid making any little mistakes you have to clean up, especially over this grey primer. I want that to stay the base coat for all of the uniform. Now after that fella, I've also used saddle brown on my big gunner here. It's a pretty good base coat for nice dark skin, and it's going to work really well with the shade that I'm using later. Now this fella here was actually the color test. When I'm doing a unit like this, I like to paint one first so that I've got to look for how the rest is going to fit together. His webbing though is a little bit lighter than I would like. On this dude, I've used Basilicanum Grey to paint in his webbing and his pouches, his gloves and such, but it's not really quite as dark as I wanted. I wanted a sharper sort of contrast between his uniform and his webbing. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to leave that like it is, but on these guys, instead I'm going to use Basalt Grey from Vallejo. Now again, the color itself doesn't matter too much here. You could just as easily use something like Mechanicus Standard Grey. It's much of a much. So straight over all of his webbing and his gloves and such. Anything fabric that I want to be a little bit darker. Now that is much more in keeping with my original idea, and I like that little bit darker finish. Yeah, that looks cool. What I'm going to move on to now is the armor and any hard parts, and what I'm going to use is Black Legion for this. So I'll load my brush up, and yeah, Black Legion's wonderful. It covers very much like a traditional acrylic, but it just flows a little easier, so you could use an ordinary black paint here if you wanted to. There's nothing stopping you. So all the little bits that I want to be hard and either like a metallic or a plastic finish, Black Legion, away we go. Now once that's done, the temptation is always going to be to overthink these packs. But remember, if you're looking at near future or modern military equipment, most of it's painted or assembled in such a way that it isn't covered in 3,000 different colors. So don't be afraid on miniatures like this to just paint things one color. So what I've got here, this is Vallejo Game Color's new Gunmetal, or Dark Gunmetal specifically. And I'm using this because I want, well, a nice dark gunmetal. You could use Iron Legion from CITADEL if you wanted here. I'm just going to go all over the weapons, and you'll see it covers very nicely. Now on the helmets, there's a chin strap, and then there's a little strap around the back of the helmet holding these goggly sort of things on the top of their heads. Over this, I'm going to apply Garaghak sewer, and honestly, you could make the case that this ought to be used for the straps on their legs as well, but that's up to you. I really just wanted something different at this point because a little bit of brown is going to add some visual interest without adding a whole bunch of extra color. But of course, you could also just paint these gray too. It's really up to you. Now I'm going to use some Leadbelcher and paint in the Dealy Bopper on his helmet. And I'm also going to paint this little camera thing on his shoulder with it. I did decide in the end to add a little bit of silver to the packs. Just those little nodules at the bottom, I don't know. It adds a bit more visual interest to it, I think. What I'm going to do now is the last base coat before we shade these guys. I've got cork brown and I'm going to use it on this dude's hair. Obviously, it doesn't matter too much what color you're using. It's hair. Pick a color you like. Okay, scratch that. I told a tiny wee lie. I've got here Black Templar, and I'm going to paint in their boots. Now, why Black Templar when I've used Black Legion elsewhere? Black Templar has a very slight bluish finish to it, which I think makes it work better for leather. But again, you could just use Black Legion or any other thing. You could even paint them brown, but this is what I'm going to use. Now, there's a few little details that we are going to add later, but for now that's all of the base coats done, and we're going to shade them. What I've got here is my little mix of marine juice. Now this was an old army painting method from the Forge World team. What it is equal parts of Lahmian medium, Reikland Fleshshade, and now dark tone from the army painter. I used to use Nuln oil, and that is what I've got in this pot, but the new formulation Nuln oil doesn't work in the same way. So swap it out for dark tone if you can't get the old stuff. And remember, equal parts of each. This gives us a shade which is a little bit warm. It's a brownish color, just a tiny bit of reddish warmth to it. And it works really well as a sort of universal shade. And that's exactly what I'm going to use it for. Let's start just bucketing it over the entire miniature. Do not need to be careful with this at all. Now once you've worked this into all of the recesses, we'll find somewhere for them to dry, give them about half an hour, and see what we've got. Now once that's had plenty of time to dry, you'll have something that looks like this. And honestly, you can put them on the table like this. I mean, we're not painting to impress anybody, I'm quite happy with that. But obviously we can do just a little bit more and have them look a little more interesting. I'm going to start by actually adding another shade to his skin. I've got Reikland Fleshshade, and I'm just going to pop this straight over the top of all of his skin. I'm also going to do this on our dark skin fella, because the end result will also be quite useful there. Now in a minute we're going to go back and highlight his skin, but for now, while those shades dry, what I have here is Space Wolves Grey. I'm going to apply this over the trousers. Now I'm doing this after having shaded them, because if I were to contrast these first and then apply a shade over the top of that, what happens is you dull down the color. Whereas this way, the Space Wolves Grey over the top is going to stay more the original color that it is from the pot, but the shaded areas in the recesses are going to be dull and dark anyhow, so you don't really miss out on anything by doing it this way around. What you get instead is a slightly more true version of your color. You can see how that adds a bit of color, and by putting it over the top of our shaded areas, it also shades the recesses, I would say, more accurately to the color we want it to be. What I'm going to do now, though, is brighten things up with a dry brush. Now what I've got here is a tiny, tiny wee brush. This is a size 2 flat brush, and it came from the stationery aisle. What I'm going to do is very carefully and lightly just flick along most of the grey areas, so his webbing and his shirt. And you see by using a very small brush, I can tilt it either flat or against the edges of it to reach certain areas more carefully. Now don't worry too much if you do hit the black bits like his pack and what have you. Just try and brush away from areas of skin. And yeah, this is effectively our highlight. Now make sure you're going over his trousers with this as well, because ironically it will make them look more blue. Okay, now we've got a little bit more definition on some of those details. His shirt looks a little more interesting. Like I said, we're not looking for perfect. What I'm going to do now is exactly the same thing with some of that Leadbelcher from earlier. Just load up your brush, work most of it off, and then we are going to very lightly dry brush the edges of, first of all, the black packs, if you want to. You might decide that these should instead be a plasticky sort of finish. But this is how I did the shield on my test fella, and I quite like how it came out. I'm going to do the same on the weapons. It doesn't take long to make them look a little bit brighter. Now what I've got is some O.D.E.A.R steel from Vallejo. You can use this obviously off of a brush quite easily, and this is the only time that the brush you use is really going to matter. What I would suggest is you want something nice and fine that's going to keep a good point, because what I'm going to do is just some tiny wee dots and small lines on some of the areas of the metal that I want to look chipped and beaten up. Now this is a process where you can be as tidy or as random and haphazard as you like, but it actually saves you having to highlight all of the black. Just pick some areas where you reckon it's going to see a little bit of ding, a little bit of scratching and wear, and that will be enough to make it more visually interesting. At the same time, if you fancy, you can highlight some of the little bits of metallics. We'll move on now to the original skin tone that we used. So this is beige red on most of these guys, and I'm just going to highlight some of the areas. So on his face, his nose and his cheekbones, and you can leave your shaded stuff in the recesses. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is get a tiny wee bit of a bright red and a bright blue and just dot in a few details on these helmets. I will put the colors that I'm using in the description, but as always, don't get hung up on them because they don't really matter a huge amount. Just pick what you like. Now I did then sneak in a little bit of flat flesh as a final highlight on the faces, but I don't think it added a huge amount, so you could probably skip it. What I've got here is Varnish Plus from Instar, and I'm going to go over the entire miniatures with this, funnily enough. And then I'm going to go ahead and base them. Now the basing of these is where you've got a little bit of opportunity to add some more visual interest to the miniature, because at the moment, oh boy, all of that grey. So I figure, because our guys are deployed to all sorts of different regions, then a nice grassy base doesn't hurt. So let's get a look at what all of these fellas look like all together. The recipe for the base will be in the description. And there at last, my team for Majestic 13 are complete. Now you can see the fella who's also going around with the shield at the moment. He was the test piece, but altogether they look just fine. I think the slightly darker webbing does work. That's definitely closer to what I had in mind when I was first putting these together. And I think as well, it goes a long way to sort of demonstrating the reasoning behind having a slightly more interesting base on things sometimes. In particular, if you've ever collected Iron Hand Space Marines, you'll know black, white, and silver isn't always the most visually striking, but with a bit of context, it can still look quite cool. It's also not a lot of work to do, which is all the better. So go along and check out Majestic 13. I will make sure that there is links to everything in the description. And like I said, this is not a sponsored post or anything. I just thought it was awesome and had to get painting immediately. So thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paint and glue, including my remarkable producers who are coming up on screen now. You are the folks who keep me doing what I'm doing. Thank you very much. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.